All right, let me call the meeting to order. If you would all please rise for a moment of silence and then remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you, and join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So the vice chair is unable to be here today, but we have a quorum, so we'll proceed. So the first item of business is the approval of minutes for our January 4th meeting.
Mr. Chairman, these minutes have been circulated and they have been approved. At least I have received word they were approved by Vice Chair Mark Dillon, and I think I got an email from you, so I move that we accept these minutes as written.
All right, I will second that. So all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right, so the minutes are approved. Our first member of the public. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So let me introduce with congratulations and condolences, I guess. And I've already said this. So Sam Chisholm is the new chair of the Prince William County Democratic Committee. So welcome, Sam.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, do you want to make any comments or anything?
No,
Okay.
just, thank you for having me. Appreciate being here. Look forward to working with everybody.
2-6. So did we already do the minutes for the canvas and everything from last year? So
Yeah.
this is just from January?
Yeah, we just had the January one to catch up
Okay.
on, so we're all up to date.
So, okay, report from electoral board members. London, do you have anything?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would just like to say one thing. I'd like to tell all the concerned citizens out there to stop writing to me about Michelle White and about the Michelle White case. I was not on the board when Michelle White was the general registrar. I've never known her. I've never met her. Eric Olson is the only general registrar that I've ever known. Prince William County Supervisor Janine Lawson from the Princeville District appointed me, but I was not yet on the board. And I do not know anything about what was involved in the probable cause determination to bring charges against Michelle White. I don't know how the decision was made or what was involved in the decision to drop the charges. I have complete faith in Attorney General Jason Miyares and in his staff. I assume they made the right decision. So please, save your resources, save your time and money, and don't write to me about Michelle White, because I have no knowledge of what went into making either of those decisions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. General Registrar's report.
Okay,
The TV one?
oh no, that's not till new business.
Oh.
Just a short, but it won't take us too long. Okay, so on the table there, you all have a election progress report. We will put that online with the other documents from this meeting. We're in very good shape for this election. I always kind of look at, where we are in the timeline. For the public, we have about 350 tasks, a little less than that each election that we have to accomplish. Some of those things are simple things that take an hour. Some of them are things that take a team of half dozen people several weeks to accomplish. So there's a variety of tasks in there, but we have a timeline that helps us track each task that we're completing so that the management team can examine what we're behind on, what we're ahead on, what adjustments we maybe need to make to those timelines, what things we need to do to make sure we are timely completing those tasks. And right now, we just have 2 tasks that are not completed up till the current date, and we have about a half dozen that are already completed that are beyond the current date. So I think we're in excellent shape for this election. Have not had any kind of significant issues. Early voting has gone well. Mail ballot processing is going fine. So nothing of concern to report. Voting overall is pretty light this election. I think we're just past the 500 mark for early voters last week. We have a lot more mail ballots at this point than we have early voters, but turnout has been pretty light, as it often is during primary elections. So that's where we are at this point. Feel like we're in real good shape. I think, I've been here for about 2 years now, and I think it took some time for us and the whole team to kind of develop processes and figure out our workflow, but I really feel like that is kind of coming into its own and that things are going pretty well on that front. So, any questions from the board members on that?
So when are you planning to start pre-processing the mail ballots?
I think that is the 23rd, or whatever that Friday is.
It's, so setting on the 23rd and starting on the 26th.
Okay. So setting up on the 23rd and we're starting processing on the 26th.
Okay.
So we'll basically have the week of the 26th to do all of that. I think at this point, we only have, I think after we process today's ballots that are coming in, we'll probably be a little past the, 2,000 mark, 2,000 to 2,500 mark. So I think we'll get a steady numbers coming in from here. We've kind of gotten our initial burst back, so that week should be enough time to cover all those ballots. We had a little bit of a challenge in securing this room for this election. We had a slightly shorter time frame, but I think it fits with the number of ballots that we've got, and I'm actually working.
We have many teams too.
Okay,
scheduled,
yeah, we have a lot of teams scheduled as well. So we're also working with the Parks and Rec and the Historic Preservation teams to try to get them a list of dates for this room for 2024, 2025, and 2026, so that we have the space secured. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in my report a little later on too, about space generally. So.
And I've gotten a couple of the cure logs, so those are going to the political parties too, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think the parties are as actively involved in the cure process as they are in the general election, but, it's still, I think something that we're required to provide to them, and that they choose to act on it however they want,
Yeah.
Okay, and we're still getting some applications trickling in for mail ballots, or?
Yeah, I think our initial mail out was a little over 17,000 ballots. So our permanent list is voters who are requesting to have an absentee ballot every single election is close. I believe it's closing in on 30,000 ballots now, but not everybody among those voters has selected to receive a primary ballot. Maybe they don't generally vote in primary, or maybe they want to wait and see which primary they might want to vote in. But we sent out 17,000 initially. We're getting small numbers, but not a lot of ballots coming in. I think partly, to be honest with you, I haven't seen a single sign for this presidential primary anywhere in the county. We don't see heavy voting. Voting is often generated by candidates and by issues. And with two candidates who have a very strong lead and are sort of the presumptive nominees, each party kind of has one, that lack of competition tends to keep turnout down a little lower. So we haven't seen a lot of early voting. We haven't seen a lot of new applications coming in. So we'll see if that picks up as early voting goes on, or if we just have a low turnout election this election. Okay, so some other areas, I'm just gonna kind of note a few different areas. Security at early voting sites. I wanted to relay to the board that we do have officers for a number of days during early voting this election. Mostly just towards some of the busier days, but at different sites. We're probably gonna do that, expand that during the November election. I've had a lot of election officers that have raised security concerns and, some voters that have been difficult to deal with. And we want to make sure that they feel secure in the job that they're doing and that they have the support that they need. So we're trying that out this election to kind of see how that works. And then we'll report back out to you all after this election, and we'll see how that goes this election and see what we want to do for a future election. But we've had a lot of concerns from officers about just the general tense and threatening kind of environment that they work in. And as volunteers, we don't want them to have to endure some of that kind of behavior.
So how, I didn't realize you were doing this. So how, are these uniformed people, or are you moving them around? Where are they? Inside the precinct, outside? Where are the?
Uniform people, but just in the polling place, generally going to have them seated in a location, or if there's any issues in like the parking lot that need to be dealt with. I know that was an issue that was raised at a previous meeting, was just kind of general public safety in the parking lot. So they're working a few different days at a few different sites this election. That'll give us an idea for kind of how it works and if it works, and then we'll be able to make kind of an assessment after that. So I don't want to publicly say when and where they will be.
Right.
So that individuals don't necessarily know, but we're going to have them at our different early voting sites on some different days. And we'll see how that goes this election. And if the board members would like a schedule, I'm happy to provide you all with a schedule of when they'll be at those different locations. So, and I know there are some concerns in elections in general about having uniformed officers at polling place, and if that has a potentially suppressive effect sometimes. And I think these are the tough decisions when it comes down to election operations, where we have to look how the environment changes. And I think that while maybe a decade ago, you would have said, well, that's suppressive to voters. They won't feel safe at the polling places. And now I think, given the environment we're in, if we don't have officers there, you might say that could be suppressive. Voters might not feel safe at polling places. So we have them for a limited number of days this election. We'll kind of see how that goes, and then we can reassess. And if you all want to check out some of the sites and see, if there are suggestions you have about how they're, where they're positioned, I think that's part of the puzzle here is doing it in a way that helps the public to feel safe, but doesn't cause anyone to feel inhibited from voting. We don't have any police officers at our election day sites. That we do keep in touch with the police and emergency services throughout the day in case there's any issues, but there's a lot of sites to cover for that. So next topic was just the Michelle White investigation, which London already mentioned in his comments earlier. I'd echo something kind of similar, that basically, so this matter is concluded at this point. We've posted the tapes online. We put out a press release that gave a summary of what the issues were. Myself and the leadership team were not here at that time, so all we did in this instance was provide the state, who eventually referred the Attorney General, with information that led me to believe that there were some inconsistencies in that reporting. We've explained that, and I think at this point, all I can say about it, not having been here, is that it seems like because the tapes were printed without the congressional splits, and the congressional splits have to be used in the reporting of results, that there were mistakes that were made at that time. As London noted, we are not representative of the Attorney General's office. They investigated the matter. They asked our staff questions. We provided answers as best we could. Their decision as to how they proceed with that is something that, is totally unknown to us. So a few individuals, we noted in the press statement that improvements have been made, and I did get some emails saying, well, what improvements are they? How does this, relate to this matter? So I can say in relation to that investigation, the post-election process, we have canvassing results. We have a new and changed process. We've had that since my first election here, where we have not only the officers review the results, the staff reviews the results, and the board takes a final look at all the results before it's certified. So we have a thorough process there that is beyond what the state requires. We've posted all of the tapes from all the elections from last year and continue to going forward on our website, so the public can go view them, and there's transparency there. We are the only county that I'm aware of in Virginia that does that. And there have been a number of other improvements, little things like redistricting, reduce the number of splits that we have. We used to have, in 2020, we had multiple ballot scanners at every precinct. Well, we've reduced that because there wasn't really a need for that in all of the precincts. And what all of those things do is they all reduce the possibility for error. So if you keep the possibility for error and you push that down and down and down till it's very minuscule, and then you have a process in place that does the proper verification of those results, which is, your all's duty and my duty to make sure that all that is being, reported properly. Then I think that's everything that we can do to make sure that our elections are accurate, and I think we have, we've done that. So, but as to the, AG's decision to bring charges or drop charges, not something that we have any control over. All I instructed our staff to do was provide honest and helpful information to those investigators, and I think our staff did that. I know I met with them many, many times, and I'm, to be honest with you, pretty relieved this is over, because not only have I stepped into a new role as a GR here a couple years ago, but it came into a situation where there were a lot of burdens from previous leadership, not only in the time constraints of lawsuits and investigations that took place that consumed a lot of my time, but the underlying problems, the systemic things that we had to fix in this organization to make sure that we were doing things the proper way. And I think we're doing that now. I think my goal is to not only do things the proper way, but to be an exemplary agency that other agencies and localities around the state look to as a place where, things are being done right and pushing forward good practices that make for, great elections. So, anyway, that's, I think, for me, unless there's something else.
Yeah, before you move on.
Yeah.
Has there been a request for reimbursement for legal fees from Michelle White? I mean, do you know if she submitted, this case went on for over a year. Did she have legal representation, and has she requested that she be reimbursed for the legal?
I know she did have legal representation. I don't know the status of those proceedings.
We haven't received any.
No, that would be between her and the Attorney General's office.
Oh, Attorney General.
Yeah.
Brody.
So, yeah, but I haven't seen any communication on that front. So, okay, so transitioning from that to some more positive news, we have our I Voted sticker contest has just launched. So we have a new page on our website. If you go to pwcvotes.org/voting sticker, you can go see the contest rules, the contest information that is on our site now. And what we're trying to do is get entries into that contest. The criteria for the designs is that they show a uniqueness of design in relation to Prince William County. that there is clarity, strength, and effectiveness of design, and that the overall aesthetics or eye-catching ability of the sticker. So hopefully we are working right now, we're in the phase where we're trying to get entrance into this, we're trying to contact the schools. We do have prizes for the winning entry and some of our smaller prizes for our runners-up. We also have a small prize for the art department of the school that has the most entries. So we hope that we'll get, students and members of the community to enter into this contest, and we'll be promoting that over the next, several weeks. Our deadline is March 15th, I believe. So hopefully by that date, we'll have all the entries in. At that point, we will review the entries, and we'll have each board member pick their nominee as a finalist, and the staff will add a couple other nominees as finalists as well. And then we're going to have our election officers this spring and early summer vote and on which design they think would be the best. And the winner we will start using as our I voted sticker for the November election this fall. So that should be something exciting.
Are the election board members eligible to enter the contest?
No. As designers?
Yeah. We won't be able to get a prize?
No. Relatives of the staff and board members and their close relatives are omitted from being able to enter. I believe that's in the contest rules page that's on there. Do you have are you a good illustrator, London?
I've had some, came to me in a dream. I had some ideas, but, when sometimes you go to bed thinking about something, you wake up the next morning, you got the solution right there. I was
Yeah.
just wondering, this is equitable society, right? Equitable, everybody gets a prize.
Yeah.
You don't choose first, second, and third, you just give a prize to everybody.
Well, maybe you have a high schooler who you can provide your inspiration to, who can bring it into life with their painting or pencil skills.
My creative kids are in college right now.
Okay.
The ones in high school have no creative ability at all.
All right. So I got a few other small items. The party chairs did have a meeting with Sam and the two Jacobs from the GOP as well over the last week, and we talked about roles and these sort of election administrative elements that intersect with that job. So we've given them sort of a task list to help them with the different duties of their position as it relates to our office. So those were useful meetings, and nice to have made contact with the party chairs and chatted with them a little further. I did talk as well with the deputy CXO of the county about future office space and what our needs will be, both in the immediate future and in the longer term. We're trying to figure out, as elections have evolved and changed over the last 5 years, our need for space for training, for board meetings, for pre-processing and cap for absentee ballots, for so many different functions, for early voting, have just changed. And our space here is pretty limited, and especially the sort of meeting and flex space to do all those things. So trying to make some progress on that, both for what can be done over the next year or two. And I'll send the board some follow-up emails about that. I think it might be helpful for the board members to maybe provide the county leadership with some details about what our needs are and how we need that to be sort of addressed further. I kind of see that as our most significant problem right now in terms of just the general operation of the agency. So we're working on that, because I think the long-term plans for the eventual, there's going to be a new McCourt, so to speak. There's going to be a new county center, and I think we are in the plans for that, to not only have office space there, but have our warehouse be there as well. But that is probably a 7 to 10 years down the road kind of thing. So what can we do in the meantime to sort of address these needs, whether it's, securing this space, having priority for this space, expand, maybe we need to move to a different office for short term, because it's one thing when you're talking about only a couple years, but if you're talking about nearly a decade, at some point, some of these issues have to be addressed, and I think we're doing the best with what we can, and we've modified our practices. Our training team is hopping all around the county to different locations, and we've contracted out our outgoing mail, so those things save a lot of space, but we do reach an endpoint there, and we also have certain tasks that, for security purposes, need to either be at home or, very close to home. So we'll continue to work on that.
So have you done so there were a bunch of security things just at the office next door that people had identified. Have you done all the things that are on your list for that space?
We've made a lot of security upgrades over the last 2 years to that space, whether it's, changing access to the building, camera and motion sensors, alarm systems. If anything is happening in the building that shouldn't be happening in the building, we're going to get a response from the police. And I have to tell you, as the first few months we had that alarm system in, we had an issue with one of the sensors, and we got it fixed, but it was causing it to go off when we thought we were setting it. So myself and a few others on occasions had set off the alarm, and I can tell you our police response time is extremely fast, because having the courthouse and the jail real close, we're never going to have an officer that's far away. So we have that fixed now, and it wasn't presenting a security concern. It was just alerting the police to stop by our office more than they needed to. So we fixed that now, and our security is much stronger than it used to be, whether it's the protocols that we have in place for internal procedures or just the literal security apparatus that secures access to the building. I know when I started, we had doors that you had to remember to lock and close when you left. And, staff does a really good job, but what you want to do is you want to try to reduce the risk for human mistakes. So now the doors automatically, lock when you go in and out of them.
So I know that, or I believe that the courthouse expansion was on an earlier to-do list than the general, a new McCourt, wherever it is. So that may force, what I saw was, basically, your offices now would be gone, either as a parking lot or something else.
Yeah.
So that would force the county to find at least temporary space for your office.
Yeah. I think they're trying to finalize sort of those long-term plans, because I know there's several phases of that project, and by the time you get to phase 4 or 5, which I think is about in a 5 or 6 year time frame, our office is gone and it becomes part of a larger parking complex. And I believe that where our office is now will be an expanded entranceway into that parking complex. So I believe the plan is that this building will still remain as it's historic, but our office and the fire offices that are there right now will be gone.
They're old, but they're not historic.
Yes, yeah. Fall just short, a couple decades short. So we'll continue to look at that, but I did let the deputy CXO know that this was sort of our most pressing issue, and I'll talk with you all further about that over the coming months so we can try to flush out what kind of steps we can take over the next couple years to improve there. Logic and accuracy testing for this election begins tomorrow, so that will start tomorrow at our warehouse, and that will continue through the rest of the week and likely into Monday of next week. Before each election, we have to test every single machine to make sure it's working properly. So I want to make sure the public is aware of that this is something that happens every election for every machine. It's not something we do once a year, every once in a while. It's every election for every machine. I don't have anything for a voter registration report today. We only have January so far, so we don't have a lot of data, but we'll revisit that at our April board meeting when we'll have a little bit more data. I'll be able to provide you guys a little bit more information on some of the voter challenges that we've been getting and what our efforts are for cleaning our voter rolls. We will also have the February, is it February NCOA? The February NCOA that the state completes will be done by then, so we'll have data that relates to that as well. So we'll provide a little bit more detail in April because we don't have much to report on right now. As part of, it's a shame we don't have individuals here today. I hope they'll watch it on the video playback, because I had some we had some previous comments from the last couple meetings from some of the people that came up and made public comments. So I had a few responses to a couple questions that were kind of asked, or a couple issues that were kind of raised. I know that Mylene Kent had made some comments, and first off, appreciate her long service as an election officer. That's fantastic. She mentioned wanting to see improvements on paperwork and the training. I know that is something we're continuing to try to improve all the time. We got better marks for training over the last couple elections, so we'll continue to work on that. She also talked about parking lot safety, and definitely agree that that is a issue to address as we go forward. Some of our facilities make it a little bit difficult. We'll see if these officers that we're using for a little bit of the election, this election, might make that easier. So there is certain behavior, obviously, outside the polling place that we can't control. Sometimes the campaigners get into it with each other. We hope that everybody plays nice, and honestly, in the November election, by and large, they did. But that's something we'll continue to keep an eye on and try to make improvements on. Elizabeth Block noted a couple things. She mentioned some things about compliance in the last couple elections, and I would just note that our board reviews 160 different compliance standards each year. They have to set their own organizational policy for this. It's something that a lot of time goes into. So I know that I know that is an ever-evolving thing, and that we're always, evaluating that. But I do know that the board works pretty hard at reviewing all those materials and making sure that we are in compliance with the standards that we're supposed to comply with. I would note also that a lot of times the EAC gets mentioned. The EAC, well, Virginia has its own standards, and the EAC standards are not, what's the word, dispositive. They're not governing over our agency. Certainly, they provide good suggestions, and the EAC has a lot of best practices that we look at and follow, but they're not necessarily ones that we have to be compliant with. We have to meet a lot of the state standards that are provided for us, and there's a lot of those. It was also mentioned that the audit reasoning was questioned about why didn't we complete an audit as had been requested of the last elections. And I know that our staff looked into this, and there were certain requirements that made that process a lot lengthier than what we would have liked to have done. I know that we wanted to kind of examine the election day machines specifically, and that wasn't available. We had to look at all of them. And I think one thing that needs to be noted for some of the people that make comments is we have a staff, and they work really hard. They went through 3 elections last year and a recount. So all of these decisions that the board makes, and when I make recommendations, I have to take those things, into account. And if we've just done a recount and shown that the recount was exactly right in a race separated by 2 votes, then that should provide some solace to those who aren't sure if the system works correctly. I would also note that of all the localities in Virginia, we have more than 130 of them, only 3 of them opted to do an audit. So it's not like we don't have a lot of company in this area. So I think that the public needs to understand that sometimes there are a lot of different things that go into these decisions. I do think that both myself and the board are trying to be transparent as we can about those processes. That's why I just wanted to make a comment on it today, but it wasn't something that was sort of at the top of the list the last several meetings either. Carol Noggle made some comments about the voter registration at the high schools and having some challenges with those. So we're reaching out to her and her group. Part of why we added a communications specialist in Thalia is not only to make sure that our social media and information provided to the public was better and up to date, but also to look at some of our outreach events. And Thalia has done a number of outreach events, and I know we'll continue to develop that program that Ms. Noggle, I know, has been dedicated to for a long time to helping hundreds and thousands of students in this county get registered to vote, which is great. And then lastly, Carol Zarkowski, she mentioned about our printer contract and, how come we're not doing that in state. And she mentioned a few issues from previous elections, which I think we've already addressed. There's a number of different, if you go to each election, the board meetings around those elections are going to have sort of the discussions of those particular issues. But just to reiterate, we did evaluate the vendors for our print contract on a whole number of criteria. We have, as a large jurisdiction, different requirements than, say, a small jurisdiction might. So one of our criteria is, can the vendor send out ballots every single day so that we're making sure that we're keeping pace with applications as they're coming in? And I can tell you that criteria alone, there's not a lot of vendors that can meet that. When you go to a smaller vendor, they often have a requirement that they need, let's say, you to have 150 ballots before they'll send out a batch. Well, the vendor we selected didn't have any such requirement in there. So certainly the location of the vendor was one of the criteria that we evaluated. And as a matter of fact, I think K&H scored the lowest of any of the vendors that we evaluated on that category. But that's just one criteria. There's a lot of different criteria that we have to look at. And we actually have provided that in the past. So anybody that's interested in sort of the rubric that we used and the scoring we did, happy to provide that if somebody wants to FOIA us. I think we did post that in a previous meeting. I don't know if that information is online or not, but happy to provide that to anybody that would like to look at that. There was also a comment about, ballots and wanting to have ballots hand counted at the precincts for the results. Well, that is a function, again, of the state legislature. So when you come to a meeting here and you're making public comments, I think it's important to remember that there are only certain things that the board controls. There's only certain things that I can do. And we have prescribed processes from the state for a lot of the things that we do. And when you're directing those comments here, if you think the law should be different, by all means, write your state legislators, write your congressman, write your governor, write the people who have the authority to do that and make the decisions about that. And I'm sure that, that we get a lot of both Democrats and Republicans in this room, and I'm sure there are different opinions among those people about how elections should be run, and I understand that. But you should direct those comments towards, those individuals who actually have the power to change that, and not take that out on our staff, who's doing the best to make sure that we're executing the laws as they're written. So I'll try to periodically address some of these comments that people make. We don't really, the board meeting is a place for board business, and it's not a Q&A session for me, but I do want to make sure that we are being responsive to those comments, even if the answer that I give may not always be the answer that some are seeking. At least make sure that we are answering some of those questions and providing a little bit of that context. I think, too, on our website for individuals that are interested, we added a whole election security series that talks about different things that we've done for election security, and we're working on we call it the How It Works series, which is basically, we've discussed this in a few meetings about, hey, how does the absentee ballot process work from when I send in an application till when the results are reported? And so the idea of these documents is to give people some information that'll not only help them with understanding how that process works, and maybe if there's something that they want to write their legislator about, maybe it'll help them flush that out a little bit, but also to show them that there are a lot of safeguards that go into this process when we are managing each election. So that is it for my report today.
All right, new business, appoint new election officers.
All right, so you all have a list there. The party chairs have provided feedback. We had one officer who was an existing officer that was a nonpartisan officer who asked to be a Democrat, and the Democratic Party chair has approved that. And the Democratic Party chair reviewed the Dem nominees, and the Republicans reviewed the Republican nominees. We just had one switch. There was one Republican nominee who the party objected to, and we've made them a nonpartisan officer. They're bolded on your sheet there. And then, again, one officer who was a nonpartisan officer who the Republican Party decided to nominate, also bolded there. So, pretty short list this year.
So are we voting for 18 or 19 officers?
I think it is 19 here.
The existing officer is already an officer, right? We don't have to vote on him.
Well, we're voting to change his designation.
Yeah, to change the designation. So 18 new officers and then changing the designation of one existing officer.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we accept these 19 officers as election officers.
Okay. I will second that, and all in favor say aye.
Aye.
So let me ask, where does this put us in terms of total numbers, the partisan balance, and then, so I know over the last couple of years, your office has done specific outreach to try and build up, especially on the west end of the county, the more Republican officers. You know, sort of, where are we macro with, you know, the pool for this year? Are we gonna, you know, I expect that presidential years, usually there's an influx, a large influx of people just on their own that decide, hey, I want to be an election officer, so we'll get some new people, you know, that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's a natural, we've done a lot of recruitment campaigns the last couple of years. There's a natural influx of applications. I remember I had, when I used to work in DC, I had a windowsill that I had new applications that were on, and I remember the presidential year, that application pile was about that tall. So we will naturally get a lot of officers this year. I would encourage you all, the parties, if you all can reach out to the officers, to people that are interested in this. What we really would like to see is people get involved early. So don't wait till October. What happens is a lot of people apply in October. It's too late in October. You all have to nominate people. We've already got people assigned at that point. If you want to work the presidential election in 2024, the time to apply is now. Now and this summer, because by the time we get to July and August, we need to have everybody in the system. We need to have them signed up for our software that we use so they can sign up for their classes, so that, you know, Dina and Rick can assign them to their positions and communicate with them, the steps they have to take to complete their training as an officer, and all those things. So we really encourage you all to, and the party chairs, to reach out to the people and say, hey, if you want to work the presidential election, get on the stick now and apply, so that we can include you by the time November rolls around. We'll already have you in place. We do have good balance of our officers, I think, especially at the leadership level. The last couple elections, we've had pretty much a 1-for-1 in every precinct. We might have a officer here or there that drops out the last 3 or 4 days where we have to put a nonpartisan in, but that's generally just at 1 or 2 precincts. So that's been really good. Our team has done an outstanding job at that, so kudos to Dina and Rick, who both put a lot of effort into to herding the cats and making sure that all those, not only that we have enough officers, but that it meets all these requirements that we have to make sure that our officers are even by party. And I would say in general, what we usually need is, we need more Democratic officers in the western parts of the county, and we need more Republican officers in the eastern part of the county, because our overall numbers are pretty good. I'd like to see them continue to increase, but what we need are people in those areas that kind of break the mold for what officers are typically in that area, because otherwise we end up having officers that have to travel and Dina and Rick are very good at begging and cajoling the officers into making that trip. But it makes it much harder if we can get more officers in those locations for those specific parties. That would be helpful. So we will continue to try to send that message out and to reach out to voters to get more applications coming in and try to balance our numbers more. But we're looking pretty good, and we'll see. Hopefully with a big surge this year, we'll kind of be next year in the place where would be ideal.
All right, early voting modifications.
Okay. Thanks, John. Went to sleep. Okay, so for early voting, we've had the same ordinance in place since, I think, 2021. And for both the primary and the general, there is a different ordinance for the primary, a different ordinance for the general. And we'll just wait for it. It's waking up here, I think. Do I need to press that?
No.
Oh, it's on there.
Please.
Oh, there it goes. Okay. Okay, so for our early voting ordinance, our office has been evaluating current early voting locations and voting patterns. I've sent this out to our ops staff, I've sent it out to board members, and what we were trying to do is put together recommendations for the adoption of a new ordinance. So a lot of considerations and goals, go into this. So we're required by law to have early voting at the main office by 45 days before each election. So a couple weeks ago, we commenced that for this election. That generally means about 6 full weeks in a day of early voting prior to election day. Counties and cities can establish additional satellite locations with varied days and hours. So early voting satellite offices have to be established by a local ordinance. So years ago, this was actually the Electoral Board that set all of the locations, but the state changed that law a few years back, and now it is the Board of County Supervisors that ultimately makes the decisions about that. I will note that most counties do not have satellite locations, but when you get towards these larger counties, it's pretty common. I think if you look at the 20 or 15 or 20 largest counties in the state, almost all of them have some kind of satellite locations available. So there's a number of considerations for this as well. Mail voting has become more popular and is growing. And we have more data now that exists about early voting participation and patterns. So when these ordinances were passed, early voting had only been around for basically a couple years without some kind of excuse, which really limited the number of people that used it. And of course, we had the pandemic in 2020. That really skewed the voting patterns for that particular year. So now we have sort of a better idea of how voters are using this. Anytime we have an early voting site, we need to make sure that it's accessible, that it has adequate parking. It needs to be a public building that's either owned or leased by the county. There needs to be a large enough room size for, places to check in, to assist voters, for the ballot scanners, for the voting booths, and then we need a location where all of the equipment can be secured. So we have some challenges in this county. We do have limited space at all of our early voting sites. I will say they're fairly small, especially compared to some of the larger jurisdictions that, I've been in. We also have a limited number of Prince William County locations appropriate for early voting. So the picture on the right here is Nancy Dasick Community Center, which is in Montgomery County, which they have about 15 of these around the county that have multi-purpose rooms, gymnasiums, locations that are all owned by the county and great for early voting. We do not have many of those here in early voting in Prince William County, so we have to look at libraries, at other historic sites, at other locations. So we have to consider that when we're coming up with recommendations for both the locations and also the amount of time that we have for early voting. So when we're looking at this, we're thinking about our overall goals, which are basically making sure that there's sufficient access to early voting for all voters, that there's geographic balance across the county, that we're making a cost-effective use of public funds, and that we're giving voters consistency, meaning that they know the locations and the times of when to go vote and that they understand those from election to election. So our current ordinances, we have two right now. We have one for primary elections and one for generals. We do not have one for specials. I will get to that later. But the number of days that they're open for the election, we have 3 locations that are open for 45 days during the primary, as well as 3 locations that are open for the general for 45 days. Those are different locations. There's also 2 locations that are open for the general in Brentsville and Dumfries. Those are not open for the primary. So that is what our current ordinance allows for. The board currently also sets hours and decides things like additional weekend voting days and elements like that. I would note too that the days these are open, the satellite sites, our office is required to be open for a set amount of time, especially on the weekends, but the satellites do not have the same time requirement as the office does.
Aren't they, but if we open a satellite, aren't they required to be open the last 2 Saturdays, or is it just
The Saturday's correct. The last 2 Saturdays, they have to be open for at least 8 hours.
Okay.
The other days, counties vary that a lot. Some counties use similar hours. I know when I was in Arlington, a number of our satellite sites during the week, we only opened them from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. So it just depends, but you do have some flexibility there. So, oops, sorry, I'm going backwards. All right, this is a map of our 2022 general election early voters. So this gives you a sense of where people in the county are early voting. It more or less functions as somewhat of a density map, ultimately. If you see light yellow, that means there's some voters there that voted early. If you see really dense or darker yellow, that means areas where you had a lot of voters. So you do see clusters where our population density is heavy. Occoquan, Neabsco, and Woodbridge, those areas very heavy. Up by Haymarket, very heavy. And you can see the areas around Manassas. Obviously, where that early voting center is located in Manassas there is surrounded by the jurisdiction of Manassas City. So it's not that nobody close to that location went to vote, it's that they go to a different location to vote. You can also see Linton Hall area has quite a few voters as well. And then there's a lot of areas, the mid-county, where you have less voters, but still voters in pretty much every corner of the county. It's just that the population density obviously is a lot less there in sort of the western parts of Occoquan and Coles District. In Brentsville, you have more spread out population. So how does this relate to our factors then? Well, in terms of access, we do okay in a primary, but we don't have a lot of sites, and they're active in only 2 of our 7 districts, although they are close to the borders of other districts. This gets a little better as you go towards the general, where we have more locations, and they're not too far from most voters at that point when you add those. In terms of balance across the county, we have a pretty good spread. You've got 1 kind of towards the west, 1 in the middle, and then 1 in the eastern part of the county, but again, few sites. This doesn't balance out very well if you're talking about population distribution, if you looked at that map that I just showed you, kind of where our population is. So if you were to split Prince William County in half population-wise, the point at which that halfway point is much closer to the east part of the county. If you look at each of these districts and you consider that each of these districts is about just under 70,000 voters and they're all approximately the same size, you can see we've got 4 of them in the eastern part of the county, especially when you look at Potomac, which is mostly trees as you get towards the western part of Potomac. You can see that a lot of the county is really, a lot of the population is really clustered in the eastern part of the county, and then it's very spread across the western part of the county. So in terms of balance, as we have more sites, that does show some balance in the general elections. In terms of cost effectiveness, this setup that we have currently is not the most cost effective. If you look at the first 4 weeks of last year's primary, we had just over 2,500 voters. We beat that in only the last 4 days of voting. And that costs a lot of money to run those centers week after week because we have to have at least a minimum number of election officers to run each of them. So this is a look at how that kind of spreads out day by day for the entirety of early voting. This is in the 2023 primary. You can see that really when you get to this last week or so, it really picks up, and especially the last 3 or 4 days, now you're having a lot more voters. Looking at this for a general election, very similar pattern, although your numbers are much higher. You can see most days you have somewhere around 500 voters across all of these locations, and then it really picks up again during the last week, and even the last 2 weeks a little bit here on certain days. You can see that Sunday voting kind of jumped up, and then that kind of kicked off the final period here. To put in perspective, primary elections, this is the last day of that primary. So the really tall last day you see in this primary election thing here, which shows just under 1,200 voters, looks like this when you compare it to a general. And then this is what an average day of a primary looks like compared to a general election. So you can see that for primaries, far fewer voters than we have for a general election. In terms of consistency, this is where I think there's a bit of a struggle here. We've got these 2 sites for Lazo and DMV that bounce back and forth, and we do get calls, when early voting starts saying, hey, why isn't voting, especially at the DMV, when we don't have that in the primary, people call and say, hey, why don't we have voting at the DMV? I thought that was my early voting location. And then again, these 2 sites are only open during the general election. So this makes it a little harder for voters to build habits if you don't have a set location that they know they can go to each early voting period. Then it makes it hard for them to kind of build in habits as to where and how they want to vote. So like most first drafts, they require review, input, and revisions. This is the original Apple computer. It looks a little bit different than the Apple computers do today. So we've got to look at these things and look at some of the data and information that we have that help us to make decisions. So a few observations here. Most large localities offer more satellite locations than Prince William County does. So if you look at this, while we do have sites open for the entire time, that's good. And we do have Sunday voting, which a lot of our other larger jurisdictions don't offer. We have a much smaller number of satellites, and we're open for a much longer period. So as I showed you earlier, that means that we have a lot of days where we have voters that are not many voters voting while we have locations open, but we're not necessarily expanding the number of locations that some of our similarly sized jurisdictions and localities have for voting, for early voting. Primary elections are not only much smaller than general elections, but fewer voters use early voting during those primaries. So for starters, I don't know if people always understand how dramatic the difference is between a primary and election. You're talking about 3 to 5 times as many voters for a general as you are for a primary. So that's where it starts. And obviously you see in certain years when you only have, let's say, one party's primary, that can change too. I think 2022, I believe, is just a Republican primary and only for part of the county, correct? So obviously turnout wasn't going to be as high for that election. But what we also see, so in a primary election, we might see somewhere in the range of 25 to 40,000 voters, whereas a general election, we're usually seeing 120 to 160,000 voters, and that really jumps up to well over 200,000 when you get to a presidential year. But not only are we seeing the raw numbers higher, but the percentage of voters that use early voting in those primary elections is lower. So you're already starting with a lower threshold, a lower number of voters, and then an even smaller portion of them are using early voting. You can see that our general election, pretty consistent. It's been around 25%, maybe close to 30% over the past several years. But our primary numbers kind of jump all around. A little tougher to predict, but certainly always lower than what that general turnout is. Another observation, mail voting is not only growing faster than early voting, it is the choice of, quote, early voters. So these are the voters we talked about early, those small numbers that we see for the first several weeks, those voters that are really like excited to get out and vote, or maybe they're going out of town and they need to get their vote in before they head off for a 3-week vacation or a work trip they've got to do, or a loved one that they have to take care of. So those voters are the ones that they're opting more often now for mail voting, which right now is about 15% of our vote total. Early voting is about 25%, and election day is about 60%. So I would say overall early voting is kind of flat right now. We might continue to see it go up, especially if we add some locations. Mail voting is continuing to increase, and election day is dropping slightly. So to give you an example of this, when we're talking about right now, we've had the first 2 weeks of early voting. So those early voters we were talking about, through the end of the week last week, only 541 of them have chosen to go to an early voting site to vote in person, whereas almost 2,500 of them have sent back their ballots already to vote in this primary. So more of them are choosing mail as their option, which is then drawing off people that maybe would have gone out and voted in those first few weeks. More of them are now voting by mail. So this leaves us with, we want to make a recommendation for the new ordinance. The Board of County Supervisors can opt to take our recommendation, or they might go their own way on it, or they might take elements of our recommendation combined with some of their own wisdom and input for how they want to see this enacted. But here's our overall recommendations for a new early voting ordinance. And the timeline for this would be to try to make this happen by the late spring or summer, so that by the fall presidential election, this is in place. One would be expand the number of satellites for access and balance. So making sure that we are geographically balanced, politically balanced across the county, and making sure that more voters are closer and have access to early voting locations. Secondly, use the same locations for all elections. Make it consistent so that voters know, hey, if there's an election, Brentsville's open, I just have to check on what date and time it's open, and I can go to that location to vote. 3, adjust the start date of satellite location opening. That's a good way to kind of control for costs and also to meet the demands of voters. Change those dates to make it appropriate to the election that is in front of us. And then lastly, define satellite locations for special elections. That just doesn't exist in the current ordinance. And for example, last year when we had a special election in Haymarket in February, I believe, voters were expecting to be able to go to Haymarket Library to vote, and there's no definition for that in the ordinance. So we want to make sure that the ordinance is kind of set up to include that. So item 1, expanding the number of locations. We're just recommending we use all of our current early voting sites for all elections. The supervisors have already worked out these locations. They've already been in use. We know that they work. And I think that when we're looking at we looked at some other possibilities for this and other locations, for examples, Coles would be a great location. Colgan High School would be a great location because it's right in the middle of the county. It's right on 234. It has huge parking lot, but the trouble is school is in session. So when you've got a November election, it's not going to work too well to have early voting there for several weeks and while school is in session. So we know these locations work. Voters are familiar with them already. They've kind of been set up for balance already. And if you look at the balance of them, if you think about that population line, maybe it's on a future slide, we've got 3 on the west side of the county and we've got 3 on the east side of the county. So they kind of meet, the locations in the east are closer together, but that's because the population density is there. Whereas the ones in the west are more spread out, but those are closer to, the population base is more spread out there, and the office would be open for all 45 days. So that's always a location that's available, and it's somewhat centralized in the county. Also has a lot of the major roads in the county that go through there. So again, using the same locations for all elections, using those locations that are known to voters, 3 sites on each side, and then all the magisterial districts. Really, if you look at it, every magisterial district has at least 2 sites that are within that magisterial district or very close. So in this example, Coles doesn't have any, but both Brentsville Courthouse and the main office are close to a lot of Coles residents there. Woodbridge, I believe, I think Ferlazzo's technically in Potomac? Is it in Neabsco?
It's in the
Okay, it's right on the border of all 3 though.
Right.
So I don't think Woodbridge has any technically in this drawing either, but the DMV and Ferlazzo are both good locations that are very accessible to the residents of Woodbridge. So it does that. And voters also will know these locations are in use whenever there's an election, so they don't have to play this guessing game of which locations are available or not. The only thing they'd have to check is the start date. So going to the start date, here is our current primaries. The green shaded area is basically a day when these sites are open for most election. Obviously, the Electoral Board can opt to, add Sundays, take it away, add Saturdays, take them away, adjust the hours slightly during the week. But these are the days that they're open during the primary. And then during a general, we add Brentsville and Dumfries for those last, for those last 2 weeks. So satellites are not used much for most of early voting. If you look at this threshold line, that line there is sort of an imaginary threshold of the capacity for the number of voters we can process. So we have a really high capacity, but we don't have enough voters, and a lot of them are sort of trickling in for the first several weeks. And then we have a lot more capacity available than what's currently happening. So I'm recommending what I call basically the 1-2-3 system here, which is that satellite sites have a week for the primary, 2 weeks for the general, and 3 weeks for the presidential general. And this is, especially this stuff, is stuff I kind of expect to be tweaked and molded around a little bit. I'd be curious to what the board members' thoughts are on how we build this. So the new primary schedule would look something like this. Basically, a Saturday to Saturday with that Sunday included. We did talk about this with staff, and we talked about Friday or Thursday, possibly we may add that to as well. And that's definitely a possibility that we could do. But I don't know if it's really necessary given the small number of voters that we usually see in a primary. So to put it in perspective, if we had 5 satellites in the office open, and assuming that each of those locations can handle, 600, 700, 800 voters in a day without too much of a line building up, you're now talking about 4,000 or 5,000 voters that can be processed each day at each of those locations. Well, if you have 8 days, that's all the voters for a primary over the course of that little over a week. And obviously, some voters are going to choose to vote on election day, and some voters are going to choose to send in their mail ballot. But it gives you an idea of the capacity that this builds at all of those locations. So this does give broader access to the public to early voting because it puts more locations around the county closer to them. It puts the locations open during the most popular times for voting, and it still provides 3 weekend days for voting. And our main office and mail voting can still be used for the, quote, early voters who want to vote over those first several weeks. For general elections, we would expand it. We know that we have more voters. We want to be open for a longer period of time. So this would be basically covering those last 2 weeks, starting on Sunday, ending the following Saturday. That Sunday start is somewhat unique, and I think we can draw attention to voters of the sites being open, which would be great for getting more voters to use early voting, to get out and cast their ballots. So that would be great. It's kind of unique right now. I think in this past general, that Sunday that's 2 days and 2 weeks before the election was only open for voting in our county and Manassas City. So I think it's something that can kind of be a Prince William County thing, which would be great. And again, this covers the highest voting period without having much of the length of lines, and does allow for 3 different weekends of voting. So if you're going to be out of town at different times, either that first Sunday or the last 2 Saturdays are all on different weekends. So if you're in town on one of those weekends, you have an option that's available to you at all of these different locations around the county, at 6 locations in total. Finally, during the presidential general, we would recommend expanding that for an additional week. So you would have 3 full weeks with 5 different weekend days over the course of, 4 weekends there? 4 different weekends. So that gives voters a lot of options. That creates more capacity during a presidential election. And this actually increased costs only for the busiest election in the 4-year cycle when it's appropriate. And yeah, all those weekend days of voting really help give voters more access. And that's just once every 4 years, one election in every 4-year cycle. So if you look at what this costs, right now when we have a primary, the difference between a primary and a presidential general is negligible. It really doesn't change that much. In the new system, this would be much more cost effective, because we'd be reducing the number of officers we need and providing more locations to voters in the primary election, and it would cost less. And it only is going to cost more during presidential general when it's appropriate, because we're going to have so many voters that are going to want to use that option, because we have such a surge in voter participation in those elections. So overall, this actually saves about $120,000 over every 4-year cycle while broadening access to early voting. That could pay for a voter ballot every year almost. So that's a nice amount of savings. It's not a budget changer, but I do think it's important that we're responsible with public dollars and we use them in cost-effective ways. So, in terms of hours, our staff kind of suggested that we open on. We like the Sunday voting, and the Electoral Board has been unanimously supportive of Sunday voting. We do recommend that for election officers at more sites and the availability, that we would start that a little later, like maybe 11 or 12 o'clock, because we don't tend to get a lot of voters early in the day, and it's also harder to get election officers to have to be there. They have to arrive at like 7:30 or 8 o'clock to get that location open. It's a little bit rough for them on Sundays. Weekdays and Saturdays would be the same hours that we've been using, which has been effective. This could be modified though. Oops, sorry, went too fast here. And I think the supervisors could also provide a provision for the Electoral Board to modify things like the weekday hours based on projected turnout during elections. So it may be, if we only have a primary that's only one party in one part of the county, then maybe it would be appropriate for during the week the Electoral Board to say, well, we're just going to open from noon to 5 each day, or something like that, to make it fit to what works for that particular election. The last component here is special elections. Mostly just wanting to codify that into the ordinance and specify that the use of any satellite locations in that district would be in use if it's not a countywide. Obviously, for a countywide, you'd want to use the same number of locations and maybe the time scale of a primary. If it's a special, like let's say, like we had the Gainesville special last year, that any early voting sites that are in that district that contain an early voting site, that early voting site would be used for that special election in line with the timeline for a primary. So I think for this plan, it broadens the access by making more locations for voters. It makes sure we have good geographic balance by having the same number of locations on the west part of the county and the east part of the county, which is both a population density argument And I know that while this is not our domain here, at least not my domain here, that the Board of County Supervisors do represent the political parties, and they're probably going to want to see the west side of the county, which is generally more Republican, and the eastern side of the county, which is generally more Democratic, have some balance there, so that kind of equalizes that. It provides for a more cost-effective use of our public funds, and this gives voters consistency by having the same locations available for each election. So voters know they can rely on Brentsville or Ferlazzo or Haymarket or wherever it is that they want to go vote. It's going to be open each election. So that is sort of the recommendations that have been built off a lot of information gathering and looking at the data of voting patterns from the past several years. I'd be curious and happy to hear for any feedback of how we can modify this, but I'm hoping that we can present this information to the county supervisors over the next couple of months, and we can move forward with some kind of law ordinance change in this area. And I could go back to a slide if there's anything you want to run back to.
Obviously, a lot of planning is going into this, and looks like it would enhance voter turnout. I see nothing in here that would suppress the vote, so sounds good to me.
Okay.
So the basic plan would be the main office for the entire 45 days, and then all the satellites would open for shorter periods, but they would all be open for the same period of time.
Yes.
Depending on which election cycle.
Yeah. So for a primary and then a general and a presidential general, we would modify that slightly, but yeah, they would all open on the same day. That can be really good too from a media standpoint, from drawing attention to it, where when you open at the office, I feel like it's so far in advance of the election, there's oftentimes not a lot of coverage of that. But if you have all these locations that are opening on the same day in all these places around the county, that's definitely a place where we can engage local media, especially with that Sunday voting. That's kind of unique, and I do think that provides an opportunity to make voters aware, not only that want to vote on that Sunday, but also that might want to vote, later that week or the next week, to be able to go, oh, okay, early voting has gotten rolling. So, yeah, that would be the general thought. And I think that's pretty in line with the other large jurisdictions I've been in. The other jurisdictions that I've been in DC and Maryland, in Arlington, in DC and Maryland, the early voting period was not as long in general. So in Maryland in particular, I think it was only 8 days, but they did a lot of sites to cover for that. So they did, because it was only open for 8 days, they did like 13 or 14 different sites around the county. So that provides, population-wise, roughly a site for every 100,000 voters or so to go to for that week. So if you look at our population here, we're kind of similar to that, where for a primary, you have about 500,000, residents of Prince William County. I should say 100,000 per residents per voting site. Now, they're not all necessarily registered, obviously. But we have about 500,000 here. We have 6 locations that would be open. So that's a little better than that ratio. And this would actually be open for a longer period of time than that, with, of course, the office still being an option if you're, going overseas for a month from a job assignment in the middle of 3 weeks before the election. You can still come up to the office and vote at that point, or you can apply to have a mail ballot sent to you as well. So I think that is as we were looking at this, I think a factor that really weighed more heavily as it went on was noticing that a lot of the early voters, a lot more of them are using mail than going to the early voting sites, which kind of paves the way for this to make, I think this made sense before. I think that observation makes it make even more sense.
So is the goal to have this in place before the June primary, or have it in place for November and then subsequent
November and then subsequent elections. There's not, the timeline to do this before June is not there at this point, because when the Board of County Supervisors passes an ordinance, there are certain advertising and process requirements that have to take place. So if they're going to pass an ordinance, you need a good span of a couple months before that to, get the information to them, have them consider it, finalize language, publish that, advertise that language to the public, take a vote on it. And then in our instance, once an ordinance is passed here, the Attorney General's office has to issue a statement of no objection, and that can take up to 60 days. So since early voting for the general election would begin in mid to late September this year, we'd want to make sure that by mid-July that this is done, so that certificate of no objection can be completed before that early voting would commence. So I'd like to do it sooner than that. I'd like to see if we get something for this, passed by May or June, so that we're ahead of that schedule. That way, if there is any complication, there's opportunity to adjust that. So
are there any places that do evening hours? I've had people say, well, why instead of opening from 8:30 to 5, why don't you open from 2 to 9 or something? For early voting. Are there places that use evening hours instead of being open during the day?
Yeah, we did that I know in Arlington we did that during the week. We opened from 2 to 7, and it was only on certain days, I believe. People did like it. We've noticed here that our data, when we have, I think, John, have we been open late before?
Yeah, last time we did that was 2020. I think it was Tuesdays and Thursdays until 8 p.m.
So one option would be just to have certain days where you're open a little later, or start and end a little later. I think that there's an argument. We didn't have a lot of voters that used those late hours. We did in Arlington, but Arlington is a more dense community. It's a younger community, so the voting patterns might be a little bit different than what we'd see in Prince William County. So I certainly think that would be an option, and we could do something like Tuesdays and Thursdays, we open from noon to 7, or 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. on those days instead. Going back to the consistency, it becomes one of those things where you're trying to weigh, okay, what is most useful to voters, when do they want to vote, and also what sort of reinforces consistency for people knowing, well, if the early voting center has opened up for this election, I know they're open from 8:30 to 4:30, and I can go over there during those hours. But certainly that's something that we can look at. I also think that that's something that the supervisors could bake into the ordinance to basically say, give the electoral board the authority to modify those hours based on needs, as long as it's within certain parameters, as long as we're meeting certain basic things, but, the ability to extend hours on certain days and things like that. I think that would be smart.
And are we comfortable with the availability of the Brentsville Courthouse and Dumfries Town Hall? I mean, the other three are sort of, everyone's used to those, but, Dumfries and Brentsville, I mean, are we sure we're going to be able to have those every election for every year?
Well, we're using them right now for 2 weeks during the general. So this is only different in a general by 2 days, and then it would be 1 more week during the primary. So I don't think it would be a problem. I don't think any of the locations that we're at, this would be less stress on Haymarket, Ferlazzo, and the DMV, some of those other sites, so we wouldn't need them as much. I'm sure the Haymarket Library would be staff would be happy that we wouldn't be there for as long. But the DMV is obviously not a problem. We have that location leased, so that, and our office is easy. Those spaces are easy. We can use those anytime we need to. In terms of the ordinance, I mean, that's partly why this is coming from the supervisors. So if the supervisors are saying, we need these sites to be available for these periods, then they're going to get their way, whether it's convenient for those facilities or not. But I don't think that any locations we're in, Haymarket we would be at less. For Lazo is not a heavily used facility right now anyway, so I think that's fine. It's only, partially used at this point. Dumfries and Brentsville are the only two that it would really be a change for. So, and it's really just one more week whenever there's a primary, and then one additional week in a presidential year for that third week. So, one extra week most years and 2 extra weeks in a presidential year. I think that's pretty doable. Yeah, I think
Well, I like the plan also, and probably the consistency is the biggest thing that people complain about. So once you have, something that's consistent for, all locations during every election period, then hopefully that would satisfy their complaints about that.
Yeah. Well, I think, and so we'll present it. If you all have any further feedback as you think about it more, please send that to me, and I'll finalize this for presentation to the supervisors. And like I said, we make our recommendation, and they can accept that in full, accept it in part, and it's ultimately going to be their decision. But as sort of the, content experts on this area, we try to provide the best information we can. And I think at this point, at least we have a lot more data on voting patterns than we did, 5 years ago. So that really helps to inform the decision. Hopefully we can work towards something like this. I think it would provide wider access for more voters, and I think that's the, most important thing. If it cuts costs and makes the process a little easier on our election officers who, they certainly get their reading in the early weeks of a primary election, working at these early voting sites. That would be all the better for those reasons as well.
Any other questions? No. Okay. All right. Great. So, yeah, that's and so yeah. For Lazo was really, for years and years we had the 3 locations, and we used the DMV for every election, and then because of the pandemic, the health department said we really don't think you should be in the DMV because of the size of the location. So that's why they voted, I think, to move the primaries to Lazo, and it was more just because of the pandemic and those issues, rather than any sense of geographic balance or anything else. But, yeah. No, I think this is a great great suggestion. Okay, so we are now at public comment period. We don't have anyone signed up. Is there anyone in the public that would like to provide any comment? Yes, sir. Would you come up to the podium? And if I could get you to, after you're finished, to fill this out so we...
Okay. Greg Gorham, live in Gainesville District, and I happened upon this meeting by chance, which is nice. I know it's not appropriate for this ordinance, but I would suggest that we register an opinion on the 45-day window and how it's costing us a lot of money to keep that open for a relatively minor advantage. If you really think that's an advantage, then you really should have all those locations open from day one. But since you don't, you see the value only closer to the day of the election. I suggest you try to get them to have a more reasonable window and coordinate that with other counties that have the same opinion. I understand this is not something unique to just one area. So that's all. Thank you.
So, anyone else that wants to make public comment? Seeing none, okay, do we have anything for closed session? Yeah.
No, I don't think we need a closed session this meeting.
All right. So, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Being there are no other business to be transacted, I move that we adjourn this electoral board meeting.
I will second that. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
So we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.